Peter Beinart worked at the New York Times for a number of years, and today he edits Jewish Currents, which is an excellent magazine. His new book is out now called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, and he's my guest today. Why don't we start with this?
Okay.
You're someone who, for much of your life, like many American Jews, identified as a liberal Zionist, but for a little more than over a decade, or a decade ago, I should say, you did something that I think is really admirable,
Mm-hmm.
which I think far too few people do, which is that you just kind of aggressively reconsidered your own views. You ended up believing something just entirely different from I would say kind of the mythology that we're inculcated since birth in Hebrew school to believe that, Israel's this liberal democracy, the only one in the Middle East, in fact, that just that it's played this peacemaking role in general. And after many years of supporting Israel, was there a specific incident that just really catalyzed your change of mind?
There wasn't a single incident. It was more a kind of gradual sense that I was making an argument for two-state solution between a Jewish and Palestinian state, and I was in this position of constantly saying that that the possibility of partition was almost impossible. That it was kind of the two-state solution was kind of perpetually dying. And actually, it was a Palestinian friend who said to me at one point, Peter, something can't be perpetually dying. At some point, it's dead. And I kind of realized that the reason that I was always saying that I was always extending this period that was perpetually dying was that I wanted the idea of partition because I didn't want to think outside of that paradigm, because I didn't want to think outside the paradigm of Jewish statehood. And so I felt that as a writer and as a speaker, I was not being true to myself, and I wasn't convinced. I felt like, how could I convince other people if I wasn't really convincing myself anymore? And so I felt like I needed to just explore outside of this paradigm and look at people who had written from a different paradigm, a different perspective, not partition, but basically one political entity. And as I went further and further into that literature, and then kind of literature, international relations, political science literature about divided societies, it began to seem less far-fetched to me to think about a paradigm of equality rather than a paradigm of partition.
So, anyone who's followed your work knows that your criticism of Israel goes far beyond just its current genocide. For many years, you've supported the view of, Israeli human rights group B'Tselem that Israel is this apartheid state, as they say. It's a regime of Jewish supremacy from the river to the sea. And I think that goes much further than someone like Bernie Sanders on the progressive left in the United States, who insists on blaming only what he calls Netanyahu's far right wing government rather than Israeli society itself. Norman Finkelstein and others argue that type of framing just kind of exonerates Israeli society, which does largely support the ethnic cleansing and starvation of Gaza. The latest polls do show that. Do you see a distinction like Bernie Sanders does between, Netanyahu's right-wing government and Israeli society, or is the government pretty much representative of Israeli society itself?
I think it's worth distinguishing different kinds of subjects. There is a very profound divide among Jewish Israelis about Netanyahu, the individual, and about his kind of Trump-like efforts, I would say, to roll back liberal democracy for Israeli Jews, which is also interconnected with the question of the role of religion in the state, right? And so there are more secular Israelis who want religion to play a much lesser role in the state and who want to maintain liberal democratic norms for them. And they see, I think rightly, Netanyahu and his very religious government as a threat to those things. That's what the judicial overhaul protests were really about. And on those issues, I think it is possible to imagine an Israeli government that might take a very different view about internal Jewish issues having to do with the role of religion and state. And maybe somewhat less Trumpy in terms of the rule of law as it relates to Jews. Where I don't think there's a significant difference between Netanyahu and his political opponents is on how Israel should treat Palestinians. On that question, I think there is basically a broad consensus that Israel should control Palestinians without basic rights. And to a significant degree, that if Israel has the opportunity to reduce the Palestinian population, it should do that as well. And so, you could see that the short-lived government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid did not, although it was a more secular government in some ways, its policy towards Palestinians was not substantially different. And if you think about the likely group of prime ministers who could succeed Netanyahu, I don't think they would have a significantly different view about Palestinians. That's where I think there is a pretty broad consensus among Jewish Israelis. Again, not among Palestinian citizens of Israel, but among Jewish Israelis.
I want to shift now to the American Jewish diaspora, which is what a lot of your new book is about. You have a chapter on what's called the new anti-Semitism. It's been called that for over 40 years, so I don't know how new it is. But since October 7th, corporate media and legislators across the country have insisted that we're experiencing what they call a crisis of anti-Semitism, particularly on college campuses where students protest the foreign government of Israel that Americans are forced to subsidize every year with billions of dollars. But if you look closely at the reports of anti-Semitism on college campuses, I found that the vast majority of these so-called anti-Semitic incidents aren't really anti-Semitic at all. A lot of the time, it's just Zionist students feeling a certain way about pro-Palestinian protesters, like their chants from the river to the sea, or globalize the Intifada. Is that anti-Semitism though? I mean, isn't the problem then that there are some students on campus that personally identify with the foreign government, and therefore they feel unsafe or uncomfortable when other students criticize that government, when it commits war crimes. Is that anti-Semitism though?
I think it's worth distinguishing several different kinds of incidents. There are some incidents of, I think, what are genuine anti-Semitism, which often happen as a result of the conflation of being pro-Israel and being Jewish, right? So a situation in which a Jewish student who's wearing a kippah is, harassed or mistreated in some way because people see that religious symbol as a symbol of being pro-Israel, and they take that out on the Jewish student, which is wrong, right? And I do think that's just as wrong as taking out your hostility towards People's Republic of China against some Chinese American or Asian American person, right? So I think that is bigotry. There's a second category, I think, of hostility or even discrimination against Israelis or pro-Israel students. And I don't think that's anti-Semitic, but it still may be wrong. So for instance, I don't think if you're in a science lab with someone and the kid is Israeli, or they are prominently pro-Israel, activists, I don't think it's right on a college campus to say, I'm not going to work with this person on the lab experiment because for some kind of ideological or national litmus test. It may not be anti-Semitic because you're doing it because of their nationality or their political orientation, but I still think that's wrong, right? Just as I think it would be wrong to do that if the person was a Trump supporter, right? Um, um, but I think then there's a third category which you're talking about, which I agree, I think is a substantial category of things, which is that people are making statements that are anti-Zionist or which support violent resistance against Israel, and students interpret that as kind of making them unsafe, right? Now, again, if someone is physically harassing you or intimidating you, going to your room, making threats, that's wrong, right? But if not, but to be made ideologically uncomfortable because someone doesn't support the idea of a Jewish state, or even if someone supports violent resistance, right? If someone supports violent resistance against Israel, that would make some Jewish students uncomfortable. If someone wears a t-shirt that says, I stand with the IDF, Israel has the right to defend itself, that's also a statement in support of violence. And I could imagine many Palestinians would feel very uncomfortable about that. But that's speech which should be protected, and being ideologically uncomfortable is not the same as being unsafe. And I think what you see often is a conflation of those two things.
Right. And one of the reasons why I'm interrogating this narrative about the crisis of anti-Semitism is the ways that it's being wielded, especially now by the Trump administration to crack down on universities and impose new speech codes, even to deport people from the country who are here legally on visas.
Right.
I want to look at this further because the argument is really that this is a unique form of bigotry.
Mhm.
There's a really revealing line in the Harvard anti-Semitism report that actually admits that Jewish students face lower levels of alienation or
Mhm.
shunning
Right,
than Muslim students at
right.
Harvard, which suggests that if there is a crisis, it's Islamophobia, not really anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
And I think that you can really see this in our politics with someone like Zoran Mamdani. They're dragged through the mud as a raging anti-Semite, even
yes,
though he, literally won the Jewish vote,
yes,
while simultaneously being targeted with just these incredibly vicious Islamophobic smears from, Fox News and other right-wing outlets. And it
yes,
really does seem like you could say anything you want about Muslims in America and just face no consequences. But if
right.
you criticize this foreign government of Israel, just this mob of kind of oligarchs in the Israel lobby will just descend upon you, brand you an anti-Semite. Um, I, I'm wondering how can there be a crisis of anti-Semitism in a country where just every major institution just vigilantly polices any speech against Israel, but then openly tolerates
Yeah,
just bigotry against Muslims?
yeah. I guess the way I think about it is that I do think there are rising levels of anti-Semitism, mostly on the right, which are connected to the kind of crisis of liberal democracy in the United States and the efforts to turn America into a white Christian ethno state, right? And so those forces, tend to be hostile to anybody who challenges or defies the kind of their vision of who is a true American, right? And so they tend to be anti-Black, anti-LGBT, anti-immigrant, certainly Islamophobic, and often also anti-Semitic. These things go hand in hand. What I think distinguishes, though, anti-Semitism from some of these other forms of bigotry, which are all rising in the pub in the kind of in public opinion in the culture, is exactly what you said, which is that with these other forms of bigotry, you see a lot of state support for these forms of bigotry. I mean, certainly the Republican Party is almost defined by its support for, anti-Muslim, anti-trans, anti-immigrant views, but there's not this state support for that anti-Semitism. So I do think it's probably rising because anti-Semitism does travel alongside these other bigotries, but the difference is the way the state responds vis-a-vis the other forms of bigotry where the state is actually really complicit in them, whereas in this form of bigotry, the state is actually kind of fighting against them, and not just against actual anti-Semitism, but against a whole series of things that it calls anti-Semitism were actually just opposition to the state of Israel.
Let me ask you one more question about this anti-Semitism narrative, which is kind of the flip side of it. I think that another aspect of having that victimhood narrative, which you actually wrote about in your book and
Mhm.
Norman Finkelstein discussed earlier in the Holocaust industry as well, is that if you create this impression that you're always a victim, you do grant yourself license to just dominate others because you could just, by definition, never be the perpetrator. And I
Mhm.
think that that's pretty much the defense that Israel's loyalists use now. You can just shout Hamas and October
Mhm.
7th over and over again and just never reckon with the fact that you are killing hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women and children. It reminds me of something that happened earlier this year as it relates to, American Judaism in our community. For Passover this year, we were told to leave a chair open for the Israeli hostages, but
Mhm.
not for any of the 10,000 plus Palestinian hostages that are abducted and tortured by Israel. Many of them before October 7th. Um, that kind of seems like a form of Jewish supremacism.
Mhm.
Do you think that, and just for me, for looking at that, my reaction as a Jewish American, and I'm sure many other young Americans, when we were told only to leave a chair open for Jewish Israeli hostages and not Palestinian ones, was maybe a little bit of disgust, alienation.
Mhm.
I imagine what the reaction would be like from people who aren't Jewish, have no sympathy for our community. They might even become anti-Semitic from something like that. I'm wondering if you see that kind of victimhood narrative, maybe as even driving anti-Semitism in the United States.
I think there is the way I think about this is that I do think there is a legitimate place for Jews as a people with a long history of persecution to have a particular sense of solidarity and obligation towards one another. As Black Americans or LGBT Americans or Muslim, other groups of people might have, but it must not violate the basic principle that all human beings are created in the image of God and all human beings have the right to basic dignity and equal treatment, right? And so to me, I don't think there is anything wrong with the idea that we may have a special sense of obligation to Jews in distress. Certainly, our religious texts speak about this obligation a lot. You know, famously the phrase "Kol Yisrael Achavim Zeh Bazeh," all Jews are responsible for one another. But that can't be an excuse to be blind to the oppression of another people, right? That Judaism is also about a universal moral obligation, that the first people we encounter in Torah are not Jews, are not Israelites. Adam, Eve, Noah. The first covenant is not with Abraham; it's with Noah, who's not Jewish, who's not an Israelite. And I think that what you're talking about, which is this physical manifestation of the chair for the Israeli hostage, that in and itself, I think, is perfectly fine, right? But the problem is the utter absence of the acknowledgement of Palestinian suffering and indeed of our government's complicity in that suffering and the way in which the Israeli state is causing that suffering. That's to me where it seems to me things go fundamentally wrong.
Let me shift gears for a second to the media, which really is accountable or is responsible for a lot of the devastation in Gaza, has really misreported a lot of events starting in October and November of 2023. Uh, the journalists who sold, for instance, the Iraq War, like, Jeffrey Goldberg being the most famous example, they never really faced any consequences for what they said. I mean, he said that Saddam Hussein was in league with Al Qaeda, that they were working together, and that wasn't true. He actually won an award for writing that in the New Yorker. I think that the same thing is kind of happening again here with the Gaza genocide. The people who lied about, Hamas beheading babies, saying, for instance, that famine in Gaza was just a myth, that Palestinian and journalists and UNRWA are Hamas operatives, all those lies. The people who said them, I'm not sure if any of them will ever be punished. And more than that, it looks like they might be rewarded. To give you an example, prominent one, Barry Weiss and her Free Press blog, which engages in, I think it's pretty much the modern day form of Holocaust denial. It's reportedly receiving $200 million in funding from Larry Ellison and his family, even though they just this week tried to say that children are not starving to death in Gaza, even though today the IPC just declared a famine. Do you see any chance that the journalists who kind of spread that Israeli propaganda will face any accountability, or do you think that they'll just be promoted upward because they did lie on behalf of powerful interests?
I don't see, unfortunately, many examples of journalists who have faced um, accountability for having been kind of fundamentally wrong about very important questions in the past. Again, I don't, to me, the accountability that I would like to see would be that journalists, to the degree when they have public platforms, are asked tough questions about their past views and forced to reckon with those. If people kind of reckon with them and rethink things, I think that's good. I mean, I have been wrong about some very, very big things, and I'm grateful that people have been kind of willing to, still to let me rethink things, and so I think particularly over long careers, people are likely going to be wrong about things, but I think it's important to have mechanisms in which people can't simply kind of leave the scene of the disaster and then move on without ever having to confront it and rethink. It's interesting in some ways, actually. I think you can say that there's been more accountability among politicians in the sense that, I think Hillary Clinton and John McCain, for instance, actually did pay some political price for having supported the Iraq War in terms of their failures to win presidential elections. Again, but in journalism, I think, unfortunately, in my experience, that happens very rarely.
I want to ask you too about the shift in U.S. public opinion toward all these issues and the Gaza genocide, but also just public opinion toward Israel generally. There's huge shifts in American attitudes toward Israel, especially among people my age in both parties, though you wouldn't really know it from Congress because, again, that's pretty much controlled by the Israel lobby. On the right, there's Marjorie Taylor Greene and younger conservatives who actually openly oppose U.S. support for Israel on religious grounds, actually saying that their Christian faith won't permit them to support the starvation and bombing of children. Good for them. On the left, majorities of Democrats oppose Israel's genocide. Yet both parties' leaders remain pretty much in lockstep behind Israel. What do you make of just that massive disconnect between, public opinion and political elites? Do you see any potential for this kind of cross-partisan coalition of voters left and right who are really just unrepresented on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, the American political system is not representative of public opinion on a lot of things. I mean, think of gun control, for instance, right? So this is that's partly a feature of our political system. I agree that on this issue, the gap between politicians and voters has grown substantially, and I think you're right. Now is a feature of both parties in different ways. Um, I do think there is a possibility that you know, I don't know what the American political system is going to look like in 2028, but assuming we have some kind of semi-fair election, that I do think that you could find in the Democratic Party that a candidate who opposed unconditional U.S. support for Israel could get a lot of political support given the shift in Democratic public opinion. And I think that that person might actually have some appeal to some Republican voters who also feel that way in the same way that kind of Bernie Sanders did. Maybe even in the Republican Party, you might have candidates like that. So I do think that the next presidential election is likely going to be a vehicle in which I think some candidates will more anti-establishment candidates will try out a different message on Israel, and I think that they may find real success.
Let me ask you a question specifically about the Jewish community in the United States. One of the main groups that's challenging Zionism from within the Jewish community is one called If Not Now. It was founded by someone named Simona Zimmerman. She was in a film called Israelism,
Yeah.
which basically talks about how young Jews in the United States, and I know this because I went to Hebrew school and B'nai B'rith and all that stuff, are kind of inculcated since birth to, I would say, worship Israel. And I say
Mhm.
worship because that's one of the words that you kind of use in your book, and you compare it to idolatry.
Mhm.
There's a very famous clip on the internet of this Harvard professor named Ruth Weiss,
Mhm.
and she literally commands American Jews to, quote, serve in the army of words on behalf
Mhm.
of Israel, saying that
Mhm.
Israeli Jews have to serve a certain number of years in the IDF, American Jews have to serve in the propaganda war on behalf of Israel.
Your job is to make us look good. Our job is not to make you look good, American Jews. What do you have to worry about? Your job is to make us look good. And here's how you do it. Every one of us has to serve 3 years in the Army, 2 years in the Army, some of us 5 years, and then for the rest of our lives, you have got to serve 2 or 3 years in the army of words. You've got to learn to fight the political battle, which is even more important at this point than the military battle that we are. We'll fight the military battle. We're not asking you necessarily to come and be lone soldiers, although some of you can. You've got to learn how to fight back on the campuses, how to make the arguments.
Ironically, by the way, under the IHRA speech code that is being imposed on a lot of universities, saying that American Jews have a dual loyalty to Israel is anti-Semitic. But
Mhm.
that's what Weiss is commanding American Jews to do. Do you think that elite Jewish institutions, and maybe even synagogues, I would say, just need to fundamentally change their relationship with Israel and that government?
Yes, I think so. And I think what we're going to see in the years to come is the emergence of new institutions, particularly among young American Jews, that if not anti-Zionist, will be non-Zionist in the sense that they simply won't put the state at the center of what it means to be Jewish. And I think that will be not only morally important, but I actually think it will be spiritually important, because I think it's been not only a disaster for Palestinians, I think this kind of idolatry of the state, but I think it's actually been part of the reason that Jewish institutions have not been able to offer a compelling reason for why young American Jews should live Jewish lives, because Israel, in addition to the massive moral problems, it's also it's a vicarious experience. I think what Jewish institutions need to do is to be able to explain why a young American Jew who has a lot of choice in their lives, why Jewish tradition can offer them something valuable in thinking about how to live, right? That can offer them experiences of intellectual fascination and joy and community based on the questions that they're facing in their life, you know? And I think that removing Israel from the center, I think, creates a space, hopefully, for people to actually talk about and try to teach Torah in a way that actually may make it more meaningful for younger people.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with that. And hopefully we will get those new institutions. Peter, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you have to go. I hope we could speak again some other time.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I enjoyed doing it.